Josh read for us a few moments ago from Luke chapter 7. And it's interesting in that particular opening that it talks about how when Jesus referenced John the Baptist, and talked about his work, that there were people who recognized the tremendous work of John and appreciated that. But then, did you catch that the scripture said that the Pharisees rejected God's purpose for themselves? Kind of an interesting phrase, isn't it? Rejecting God's purpose for yourself. It got me to thinking about one of the major questions that humanity seems to always wrestle with. And that is, what is God's purpose for us? Why am I here? What am I all about? What should I be doing with this thing that I call life? And perhaps that morphs into another question: what is the meaning of my life? What gives my life meaning? I want to begin with just some attempts to help wrestle with that. The first one is just kind of a humorous thing. Monty Python did a movie several years ago about the meaning of life, in which I think there's 7 different categories that he humorously addresses, trying to find substance in our human existence. But in a more realistic human way, there have been philosophers throughout ages who have attempted to help us understand the purpose of being, why we are here. Plato, for example, and I apologize right up front because these are oversimplified, shortened, and this in no way is all-inclusive, but just kind of a generalization, okay? Plato thought that the meaning of life was attained within achieving the highest level of knowledge and understanding. And so the more you knew, the more you comprehended, the more that you engaged in intellectualizing our purpose, you would come to realize the reason of life. Aristotle believed the meaning of life was discovered through virtuous practices of what was for the highest good. So his was not what you knew, but more what you chose to do. And the more virtuous your actions, you were coming closer to understanding the meaning of life. Epicurus, and you've heard of him, and you've heard of that philosophy. His was that we needed to just simply enjoy life's pleasures. Enjoy the simple pleasures of life. Now, you have probably heard Epicureanism described as eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And we sometimes look at that, and our assumption is, this guy is saying, let's have one big party on, and because, that's all there is to life. But that's not exactly what he intended. His philosophy, he did not believe in an afterlife or immortality. And so his concept was the meaning of life is just what you get here. And so he then philosophized that what we need to do is enjoy the simple pleasures that exist right here, that's the only purpose we can have for finding meaning to our existence. Here's some of what he actually wrote. By pleasure, we mean the absence of pain in the body and of trouble in the soul. It is not by an unbroken succession of drinking bouts of rivalry, not by sexual lust, nor the enjoyment of fish and other delicacies of a luxurious table, which produce a pleasant life. It is sober reasoning, reaching out the grounds of every choice and avoidance, and banishing those beliefs through which the greatest tumults take possession of our soul. So he did not mean, seek for satisfying and gratifying your own pleasures. He meant just enjoying what life is, the simple pleasures of life. Another, we think about what philosophers offered. During the colonial period, the Enlightenment, the meaning of life had kind of a paradigm shift. It shifted from a focus on spiritual things, and God in particular, into a focus on relationship and society and community. And again, we see how that even in the settling of our own nation, that although there was a strong faith connection, they also began to be intertwined in their societies and their communities. And all of a sudden, there needs to be a government. There needs to be a government established to work this community. And again, God is central in all of that, but there began to be a shift in what was seen as significant and important. Life's meaning was equated with the meaning of our existence in the social order of things. Now that kind of gets us up to more modern times, and there's some interesting philosophies being propagated right now that are being thrown out. This is the meaning of life. This first one is called pragmatism. It says that only by experience can anyone find any fulfillment in their life. So those who propose this philosophy say, you just have to experience everything there is to experience in order to find real meaning. Now, that one's going to be interesting, because most of us aren't going to live long enough to experience everything that there is to experience. But that's the philosophy of the pragmatists. There's theism still around, that God needs to be center. He needs to be the center of our universe, and when that happens, we will discover the true meaning of life. There's existentialism, which says that individual life purpose is found in freedom, actions, and decisions. There is, this one I found very interesting. It's called absurdism. It's the lack of harmony between man's search for meaning and the meaninglessness of the universe. Everything is absurd. There is no meaning. Actually, as this one got explained, Kierkegaard, who actually is one of the proponents of this, said that there are only three solutions to absurdism. One is suicide. The other is religion. And the other is you just recognize you've got a lousy life and you're just going to live with it. So that's his philosophy. We just have this just an absurd existence, and we choose one of those three to try to make some sense of life. More familiar terms, perhaps, humanism, finding meaning in fulfilled self-interest, which translates then into a meaningful and successful society. We're seeing our American culture so controlled by humanism that people think the meaning of life is for me to get to do whatever I want to do, however I want to do it. And as you, as society, let me have that freedom, you are better off. Okay? That's humanism. That's a philosophy that says that's going to give us the best meaning of life. Postmodernism avoids seeking any life meaning because its nature is to view language, institutions, and society as negatively imposing such purposes. So postmodernism says there is nothing that needs to be imposed for me to find meaning in life. If you attempt to do that through language, by some institution, church, government, etc., you can't accomplish it. All of those are perceived as a negative influence on me finding who I am and what I need to be and finding meaning to life. So postmodernism says, can't be found. Okay, this is an interesting quote. There is no intrinsic evolutionary meaning to being alive. That's perhaps the most honest an evolutionist can be, isn't it? There is no meaning to life. And that's David Parash, who is a psychology and zoology professor. What is my purpose in being here? Why am I here? The quest for comprehending life's meaning and purpose obviously has been filled with many perspectives, and many prejudices have been worked into that process. Our Bible reading, though, has brought us to a place, a book, if you will, whose primary purpose is to share with us what the meaning of life is, what the purpose of being here is. It's a book called Ecclesiastes. And if you've been following along, you know that we have at least begun that book. And some have looked at this book as kind of a downer, as kind of a depressing, overwhelming presentation of how life is just, it's almost that pragmatic, that negativism. But in reality, Ecclesiastes contains some of the most intriguing rationale for understanding the purpose of living. And so this morning I want us to think about two lessons from Ecclesiastes that will help us in comprehending the meaning of our life, why we are here, our purpose. The first thing that I get from the book of Ecclesiastes is that there is no self-generated value inherent within physical life itself. In other words, if I'm going to sit down as a physical person and say, I'm going to find meaning to my life, there is nothing intrinsically involved in my physical person that's going to lead me that direction. There's nothing here that's going to accomplish that. Life itself is incompetent in delivering an objective or a direction which holds any lasting purpose. Such was the conclusion that was made by Solomon. He followed a thorough, personal, and all-encompassing examination of everything that life could possibly give by itself. He shares his conclusion right away. I, the teacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem. I devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. What a heavy burden God has laid on men. Says, I decided I was going to search. I was going to give all my heart to finding a purpose for life. The idea is that Solomon didn't hold anything back. His experimentation was 100% complete. Nothing lacked. So when he decided he was going to test something, he tested it to the full. He says, I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is twisted cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. Tonight we're going to spend a little time talking about this under the sun thing, but what we need to know about it, he's not just talking about anything that happens. He's talking about things that happen only under the sun. In other words, if we take God out of the picture and only look at life, then he says, life has nothing that's able to straighten out anything or to correct what is lacking. All self-actuated achievements of human life are meaningless, empty, vain, transitory, unsatisfying. That's the word that Solomon uses. Sometimes the translations use vanity, sometimes meaningless, sometimes futility, but it all means the same thing. It's from a root word that means to be led astray by empty acts, words, or expectations. So Solomon said, all of this stuff in this world, in this life, under the sun, cannot lead me to finding a purposeful reason for my existence. It's interesting, he uses the phrase chasing after wind, and he'll repeat that throughout the book as he evaluates various aspects. He'll say, the end is, it's meaningless, it's like chasing after the wind. The root word in Hebrew from which that comes means to tend the flock or to pasture. So when we put that together, what actually is saying is that if we attempt to find objective in these things, it's like trying to shepherd the wind. Now, we've studied some about sheep. Sheep are hard enough to shepherd. Can you imagine the task of shepherding wind? How are you going to get it to go where you want it to go? Clark is giggling under his breath over there. Yeah, especially in Nebraska, you might as well give up. There is no shepherding the wind. But that's what Solomon is saying. It is meaningless. It's like attempting to be the shepherd of the wind. There's no purpose. It can't be accomplished. How did Solomon reach these conclusions? How was it that he qualified himself to make that observation that all of these things were meaningless? I want to share with you some of his testing process. Okay, first of all, he uses intelligence in the process of testing. Here's what he says in chapter 1. I thought to myself, look, I have grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. So Solomon says, hey, I'm a pretty smart guy. I've been king. I've got extra, remember he had the gift of wisdom from God. So verse 17, then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom. So I thought, I'm no slouch. I have been given this gift of wisdom, so I'm going to try to intellectually comprehend the meaning of life and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is chasing after wind, for with much wisdom comes much sorrow, and with more knowledge, more grief. Okay, Solomon says, part of my testing was intellectual, and what I learned was I can never learn enough to find a sustainable purpose for being. There's not enough intelligence out there that's going to bring me to a conclusion. And not only is there not enough intelligence, there's not enough folly. So you can't be smart enough to come up with the meaning of life, nor can you be stupid enough to come up with the meaning of life. Neither one of those is going to make that obvious. It's not going to bring that around. Interestingly, Solomon actually identifies that with increased knowledge, with increased understanding comes what? More pain. more pain, more grief, more sorrow. So the more you know, the more you hurt. And folks, is not that true? When we understand something, when we have an intellectual understanding of something, and we watch others perhaps who don't have that understanding or who violate that understanding, isn't it true that what we know actually becomes the source of grief and sorrow? And so here's the wisest man who ever lived. And he said, you know what? I decided I was going to try to learn as much as I could learn. The more I learned, what I learned was it's meaningless, but it also increases your level of sorrow. So he tested intellect. Secondly, Solomon says he's going to test pleasure. He's going to test pleasure. Honest people are seeing that our American obsession with practicing whatever brings the highest level of personal pleasure is not producing a meaningful purpose for life. Honest people are beginning to see that. That all of this stuff doesn't do it. All of this pleasure does not accomplish it. Here's Solomon's evaluation. I thought in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is foolishness. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly. My mind still guided me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. Solomon says, I'm going to test pleasure. I'm going to test just this meaningless foolishness, this empty laughter. I'm going to binge. I'm going to live in a drunken state and see if that brings me pleasure. Does that bring me a meaning to life? Solomon said, I tested all that. Chapter 2, he will say, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. Folks, there was nothing that is pleasurable that Solomon didn't do. Not a single thing. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. A chasing after wind, nothing was gained under the sun. I don't know if you've ever thought about it this way or not. Solomon didn't have a wish list. His wish list was all done. You know, you shop on Amazon and you can either go ahead and buy it or you throw it in your wish list. That just means, I want to have this later. I want to have this later. You know, when something happens, this is what I'm going to get. Solomon never had that. It was always empty. With his pleasure completely satisfied, he discovered meaninglessness, shepherding after wind, and that there was nothing gained. So pleasure did not bring a purpose to living. So he tested intellect, he tested pleasure. Thirdly, he tested hard work. And some of us, you know, we've been taught that hard work is the meaning of life, isn't it? You know, we've been raised that the harder you work, the more you're going to feel well about who you are. So Solomon decides he's going to test hard work. And at the same time he evaluates hard work, he does the same thing he did with wisdom. Not only did he evaluate wisdom, he evaluated folly. When he tested hard work, he also tested laziness. So which of these extremes might bring some substance and purpose? Chapter 4, he said, and I saw that all labor and all achievement spring from man's envy of his neighbor. What? So much of what drives us to the work that we think is going to bring meaning to life, Solomon says, is motivated by envy. And you thought keeping up with the Joneses was a modern day term. Here Solomon's referencing that very thing. This too, he says, is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. The fool folds his hands and ruins himself. Better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. So, toil, labor, doesn't accomplish it. Occupations only provide the means by which to live. They are not life itself. That's all they do. It's often a twisted desire to live with more or a laziness to exist on little that becomes the driving purpose behind the workaholic or the person who's going to be lazy. Fourthly, Solomon's going to test community. What if I connect with people? You know, if I give myself, if I connect with other folks, is that going to bring me meaning? Is that going to bring me fulfillment? Ecclesiastes chapter 4. The youth may have come from prison to the kingship, or he may have been born in poverty within his kingdom. So he sets the stage. You've got this guy who now is king, and he started out as a prisoner, a lawbreaker, or he started out in poverty, and all of a sudden he is elevated to the position of king. Verse 15, I saw that all who lived and walked under the sun followed the youth, the king's successor. What happened to this guy? Everybody sang his praises. He is raised up. This gentleman who now is king, he has all the community behind him. Everyone is supportive of him. Verse 16, there was no end to all the people who were before him. But those who came later were not pleased with the successor. This too is meaningless and a chasing after wind. Folks, it doesn't matter how well we connect with people, because there's going to come a group of people that we're not going to connect with. And so community is not going to, by itself, bring us to a measure of satisfaction of who we are and why we're here. Various rationales exist, both positive and negative, for seeking social community. The church is a social community. There's positive in that. However, such social approval is fleeting. And it too, in the grand scale of finding purpose for who we are, it too is meaningless and shepherding wind. When it comes to its provisionary ability to offer life purpose, it results in fickleness and frustration. Okay, lastly, and there's no question about Solomon's wealth, but this is the last thing that I want to notice, that Solomon decides he's going to test and see if wealth has the ability to bring him a satisfying life. Whoever loves money never has money enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. This too is meaningless. You're never going to be wealthy enough to bring life satisfaction. Life satisfaction is not based upon wealth. Okay, so the first lesson was that life itself is incapable of bringing us to a place where we understand our purpose, our reason for existence. The second lesson that I see outlined in the book of Ecclesiastes is that the apparent may not be the real. The apparent may not represent reality. What we see may not be actually what's going on. And again, that factors into finding purpose and meaning in our life, because sometimes what we look at as purposeful or meaningful isn't really even what it appears to be. And already we've seen some of that. Chapter 6 and 7 seem to me to be a concentrated part of this book that deals with this lesson for us. What looks good may not be good, and what looks bad may not be bad. And Solomon throws out a number of contrasts in these two chapters. The first one that I want to suggest is he talks about prosperity, wealth. And he says, you work and you accumulate all this wealth and you have all of this. And then he says, you don't even know who you're going to leave it to. You don't know how they're going to use it. You don't know how they're going to abuse it. How is that going to bring satisfaction when that ability to pass on your prosperity may be abused? How is that going to bring you satisfaction? May not really be what it appears to be. How about posterity? I love the fact that, I think it's in chapter 6, that Solomon says that God, you might live long enough to have 100 children. You may have 100 children, he says. And then later on he says, you may even live 1,000 years. 1,000 years. 100 children. And then he says, they might not even bury you. Just throw the old man out in the back pasture. Things are not always as they appear. death. Chapter 7, the first few verses of that chapter have some of the most unusual language, because Solomon says the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. And then he says, you're better off, and the New Living Translation, I think, Chris can check me out, but I think the New Living actually says, you're better off to go to a funeral than you are to a party, because that's the end of every person. So again, what we think something represents may not really be what it represents. Again, continuing with that, the struggle between righteousness and wickedness is also presented by Solomon. Now, I think it's important for us to remember that the righteousness he's talking about here is the righteousness under the sun. Okay? This is not spiritual righteousness. That he's not saying, you can be too spiritually righteous. No, that's not what he's saying. And there's a lot of people want to interpret that way. But he's talking about everything under the sun. He's talking about earthly rightness. And he says, you know what? There is a rightness among humanity that sometimes may not be so right. May not always be as it appears. There is a wickedness. It may not always be exactly as it appears. I think it's in chapter 7 too. He says, don't be overly concerned if you hear somebody cursing you. Don't be too bent out of shape when you hear the gossip about you. And then don't you love what he says? Because you need to remember that you too have said some things about somebody else. And what was your motivation? You know, it doesn't always carry with it the heaviness that we think is involved in that. So, words that are spoken sometimes are not what they appear. If mortal life cannot establish life purpose, then one can conclude that such purpose must be revealed within the realm of immortality. If there is nothing in this existence that can bring us to a meaningful purpose of existence, then there must be something that is not physical that has that ability, that has that power. The lack of human ability to accurately identify the goodness or the badness of an event means that insightful understanding of such life events emerges only within that which is non-human. Evaluating the goodness or the badness of a particular event, if I'm going to ascertain that correctly, I need to get outside of the human realm in order to gain a perspective. Is that not what we recognize Scripture telling us to do? Count it all joy when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Look above the sun. And there we might understand the goodness and the badness of the events in our life. Whom or what is there that is immortal and possesses insights beyond human limitations? You see, this is why Solomon's writing this book. Interesting, he never uses the word Jehovah, which was the Jewish word for the covenant God. But 28 times he uses the word Elohim, the word for God. What is there? Well, obviously, it's God. The word Elohim stems, most scholars believe, from the word El, which means strong or leading. You want a purpose in life? You want a reason for being? Then you got to factor God into who you are, because it's there that you get the strong leading for your existence. You can't find it in the physical realm. You cannot interpret it by the goodness or badness of a particular event. A man can do nothing better than to eat and to drink and to find satisfaction in his work. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? Solomon says, hey, you put God in the mix, and all of the sudden, you're eating, you're drinking, you can be satisfied. You're not longing for more. You're not whining about it. You can be satisfied. He continues, I know that there's nothing better for man than to be happy and to do good while they live. And everyone may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all his toil. This is a gift of God. The toil doesn't give us the meaning. The things that we're eating don't give us the meaning. Laughter doesn't bring us happiness. God brings us the happiness. God is the reason we're able to eat and drink. God is the one who is providing all this. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. Oh, see there? When God's involved, no subtraction, no addition.